So I'm living in Belgium. I'm from Holland, but I'm living now 30 years here in Belgium because I got a job in Belgium and I worked afterwards a lot in Brussels as well, in European organizations, also international organizations. I'm now a freelance, so I'm independent. I'm having my own consultancy, which is called Leapfrog to SD, Sustainable Development. So I'm helping CSO, civil society organizations, to leapfrog until sustainable development, mostly in their strategy, system thinking, etc., etc. But I'm also quite involved in UN processes. I was one of the negotiators for the SDGs in New York. That was between 2013 and 2015 when they got adopted. I was at that time the organizing partner, as it is called, for all the NGOs in the world to speak on their behalf and negotiate in developing those SDGs. So I'm working a lot on advocacy, but I still have a lot of contacts as well with more field organizations, the environmental defenders all around the world. And I'm also quite active in the Antwerp citizens movement of Straten Generaal. Just explain that it's possible to be an activist and to be a professional, etc., etc. So our talk of today is, I will explain what the SDGs are. SDGs stands for Sustainable Development Goals. I will speak in the second part on SCP. You will see that you will be overwhelmed with abbreviations. SCP stands for Sustainable Consumption and Production, or it's also SDG 12. And then in the third part, we are going to talk to discuss how this is related to fair trade. Something about the 2030 agenda. Before we understand our present, I think it's important to also know something about the history. In 1854, it was for the first time that a book was published that was done by Thoreau. That was criticizing our way of living. The guy was young and he went to live in the middle of the woods because he was kind of getting tired of the overconsumption, the waste we are producing, the noise that was industry and the pollution, etc., etc. So at that time, let's say it was already that people started to think about how our way of living, what kind of impact it has on the society and on the environment. In 62, almost 100 years later, we had a book quite famous, and I really would recommend to read it, which is called Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, and she was the first one, a woman. And of course, she was silenced by the male scientists because he saw a relationship between pesticides and the killing of the birds. And that's why it is called Silent Spring, because in spring, the birds start to sing and there were no birds anymore to sing. Then 10 years later, we have The Limits to Growth. It is the report that was presented to the Club of Rome. That's a very economic book, of course, but it was already published in 72. And I will come back to that later, but I think it's still quite actual. In 67, it was for the first time that we took a picture of the planet Earth. So it was for the first time that we saw from the moon our planet. So that it's something that we are living on and that we have to take care of. It was in 72 where we also had, for the very first time, a meeting on international level on environmental issues, and that's the Stockholm Conference. So next year, in 2022, it will be 50 years ago that we had for the first time an international conference on environmental issues. It was also for the first time that governments installed ministers of environment, etc., and that for the first time we had environmental policies as such. So that's only 50 years ago. At that time, UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Programme, was also established. But we are going to talk about sustainable development, and that's, of course, more than only the environmental part. But I think it's important to know a little bit about the history of the environmental part, because it's, of course, a huge part also of sustainable development. In 1992, so 20 years after the Stockholm Conference, we had for the first time the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. From that summit, a huge, let's say, book publication was written and adopted, which is called Agenda 21. Agenda 21 has 27 principles, principles that are still very valid, like the precautionary principle, the access to information rights principle, common but differentiated responsibility principle, the fact that civil society has the right to participate in policymaking is one of the other principles. So, I mean, a lot of principles that for us are now kind of obvious, are all written down and adopted in Agenda 21. So it's, I think, even a more important book than the Agenda 2030. From that conference, we also have 3 legally binding conventions that came out. One on climate change, one on biodiversity, and one on desertification. I'm not going into that, but just to say that at that time, in 1992, it was still possible to have from a conference legally binding conventions. That's something that in the actual political environment, circumstances is getting more and more difficult for other reasons. Within the UN, you have several processes. So the climate change, biodiversity, etc. They have their own processes. So, I mean, all the things on the COP that you are familiar with now on climate change was already decided in 1992 in that framework, but is now a separate process within the UN. Of course, it's linked, but it's not. It's, let's say, another process. After that, when we adopted Agenda 22, the Commission for Sustainable Development was established in New York. So that's a New York process, as we call it. We had, because at that time I started to be active on this. So I think I started to be active in this work in 2001 or something. So before the Johannesburg Summit. So every year we had processes, meetings in New York. One was on the review on where are we with the implementation of Agenda 21, and one was on the policy years, which is more about how are we going to implement Agenda 21. Many countries, and amongst those countries, Belgium was one, started to institutionalize sustainable development in their governance structures. That sounds very difficult, but it is, or complicated, but it's, you have, in Belgium, you have the law on sustainable development. So that means that you have that in your constitution. In the constitution is written that the country is responsible also to achieve sustainable development. And then they started to have or a minister for sustainable development or a kind of committee that is linking the several ministries with each other to work on sustainable development. Maybe you remember Local Agenda 21. That was an action that a lot of local governments started to implement Local Agenda 21 in their municipalities. Civil society, as I said, was also, the participation of civil society was also very important, and it was one of the key principles of Agenda 21. And it got mainstreamed, of course, in one country better than in other countries. In some countries, it's still not there. But let's say in most of the countries, we see that civil society participation is important in policy decision-making processes. So in 2002, we had the Johannesburg Summit, Rio +10. 10 years later, we had Rio +20, and that was again in Rio de Janeiro. I'm not going into detail, but organizing that conference was, of course, also a huge work. Civil society organizations, and when I say civil society organizations, I also include indigenous people, women, youth, trade unions, business is not really civil society, but is one of the groups that is invited also to participate in those meetings, of course. it's farmers, etc. So you have 9 groups that have seats during all those meetings, and we can also discuss the things that member states are discussing. In that outcome document, the future we want, there are many commitments, but one of the commitments was that all the member states said that they would start a process to develop a sustainable development agenda with concrete goals and targets. After that, the negotiations started also, again, with a lot of civil society inputs. And in 2030, the UN General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda, or to say the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2030 Agenda has 17 goals and 169 targets. So that's quite comprehensive. And most of the topics that we all think are important are in. And I think that was at that time, and still is, I think, a very, I think it was a big victory to have that adopted worldwide by all the countries. I don't know if that would happen now again in a new political context, but at that time in 2012, the political context internationally was quite, let's say, positive. So those are the 17 goals. I'm sure you have seen this before. I really want to say something on the MDGs as well. MDGs are the Millennium Development Goals. I don't know if you know what it is, because they ended, let's say, in 2015. It was around 2000 that governments wanted to kind of develop Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were quite, top-down written. That's quite a difference with the development of the SDGs, which was really a huge process with a lot of bottom-up inputs as well. The SDGs are not a follow-up of the MDGs. The MDGs were quite development oriented, and they were only for the South. So I just made this scheme so that you know what the difference is. As I said, the MDGs were more oriented on development, and then I would say the old-fashioned development, and the SDGs about sustainability. The focus is more on developing countries, the MDGs, which is, let's say, the rich North helping the poor South. The SDGs is focused on all the countries. Which is quite important, because it's really about changing our way of living, changing our way of producing, consuming, treating the earth. So it is, it's really another focus. The MDGs had an aid and trade agenda, so it was really about having more cooperation aids to increase it and having more trade, while the SDGs is more focusing or more centered around human rights and justice, and also redistribution of wealth. And in the MDGs, there was no recognition of planetary boundaries at all. I think in general, we can say that there was no recognition of the environment at all. While in the SDGs, living within the limits is one of the principles. For the MDGs, the environment isn't kind of seen as a luxury. Maybe you cannot understand it now. I mean, in the world we are living now, but let's say 30 years ago, it was really a kind of luxury to, for mainstream people, not for all, of course. When you talk about development, because it was often said, well, no, first we need development. People have to eat. People have to have their housing and healthcare, etc. And when we have time and money left, we can take care of the environment. While I think now we know, after so many years, that environment is just basic for developing the well-being. I mean, environment. When we talk about the environment, we are not talking about the birds and the butterflies. We are really talking about clean air, clean water, healthy soils, forests as the lungs of our earth, without climate change, etc., etc. So environment is, of course, very, very basic for developing well-being. So important to know for you is that the SDGs are universal. So all the goals are exactly the same for all the countries. The targets are exactly the same. Of course, some countries did already achieve something or something not, but let's say the goals or targets are exactly the same, and the monitoring of those goals is also done in the same way for all the countries. So at least in theory, I don't say in practice, there is no north-south division anymore. It's not the rich north helping the poor south. It's now also, I think, more acknowledged that the rich north is rich because we are using a lot of natural resources and cheap labor from the south. So the interconnection between richness and poor and poorment is also, I think, better explained or at least acknowledged in the SDG agenda. And I said it already, the same goals are for all the countries. This is another way of visualizing the SDGs. It's the same SDGs, but here they made a difference between the biosphere, the environment, society, and economy. There you see, and I think that's why I really like this visualization, is that the economy is limited or should be limited because it has to fit in the capacity. I mean, the carrying capacity of the society and the carrying capacity of the biosphere. As you know, the Earth and the planet is limited. I mean, we cannot. We don't have 3 Earths, so we have only 1 planet, so it's limited. We have planetary boundaries, but we also have social boundaries. I mean, our social boundaries is that you can't work for 60, 70 hours a week. You need to be healthy to let's say to have your well-being. So you have to have your education. So in the economy, they call it also an social capital, and then capital not, of course, in means of dollars, of euros, but I mean that the richness of society also has his limits, and the economy has to fit into those social and environmental limits. This is, I think it's just nice to see on where we are at the moment, because if we want to have, let's say, if we want to be sustainable, you have to be in the quadrant that is on your right side under. Here you see the countries all over, where this is the ecological footprint, and this is, let's say, the well-being, the Human Development Index. This is the place where we all want to be. Here you see that a lot of countries, I don't know if you see my mouse going on, yeah? So here you can see that you have a lot of countries that are under still the Human Development Index, and also, let's say, not using the fair share of the ecological footprint. So those countries need to go to the right side, let's say, to really go for try to achieve more well-being. While here, all those countries, they are on a high human development level, but they are using much too much materials, ecological footprint in this diagram. So the SDGs, let's say, if everything works well, and of course I have my doubts, just like we all, but let's say at least it's the ambition that all those countries will end up in this quadrant where it is the global sustainable development quadrant, where we are below the overconsumption of our ecological footprints, and where we are all on a level of a human development that is decent for all. For the monitoring, to see on where we are at as well, the countries committed themselves to have national strategies for sustainable development. So they at least committed themselves to have an implementation strategy per country on the SDGs. That's every year we have the global reporting on the implementation of the SDGs. That is every year in July. It's the high-level political forum in New York, where several countries are presenting their voluntary national review. I'm a little bit skeptical on this one. We don't need to go into that because as you can read, it's voluntary. And they are not always telling all the problems they are facing while implementing the SDGs. So it's often a kind of PR of their own country to tell how good they are doing. But civil society groups can also attend to those meetings and give input. And luckily, they can also present their shadow reports. And sometimes you see indeed that civil society groups from a certain country have a totally different perception on how well the SDGs are already implemented or how well they are not implemented. In Europe, since Agenda 21 already, so since 92, we have seen several European Sustainable Development Strategies on paper, not so much implemented, which is quite frustrating. I mean, if you work on sustainable development for so many years and you see that Europe is writing sustainable development strategies without any follow-up on that, because there is no action plan, nor for sustainable development, but also not on the SDGs. There is also at the moment no strategy for implementing the SDGs on the European level. There was a multi-stakeholder platform in the former Commission that is not existing anymore. The reason is that now all the energy goes to the European Green Deal, which is the new growth strategy, and because of the COVID, of course, the recovery plan, the next generation. But in both, there are no real references to SDGs. Sometimes they mention the SDG as, okay, well, this is covering SDG 1 and the other one is covering SDG 12 and the others. But let's say the Agenda 2030, the idea of the 17 goals, of course, is that you have to implement them all on the same time. So it's not that you can pick your SDG and say, okay, I'm going to work on this one. No, it is, let's say, everything or nothing. Nevertheless, in the political guidelines to the commissioners, Ursula von der Leyen wrote them all that they are responsible for the implementation of the SDGs. But until now, we didn't see a lot of concretization of those plans. But SDG Watch Europe, which is a European network of 100 and something NGOs around Europe, based in Brussels, they of course are going to follow this or are following this quite closely, and are also being the watchdogs for the implementation of the SDGs on the European level. And then I go further with the second part. And that is something about sustainable consumption and production. So that's SDG 12. But before the SDGs existed, we already talked about sustainable production and consumption. There is a definition on that. You can read it on your screen. It is quite, let's say, environmental oriented. But over the time, the definition broadened also and integrated also more social dimensions in it, like decent work and minimum income and all these kind of things. And what I think is also important that the whole concept of sustainable production and consumption became also the concept for the strong sustainability and system change. Strong sustainability is let's say in the 2005 or 6, I think it was at least after Johannesburg, there are two movements, let's say, I mean, not strong movements, but let's say two tendencies within the whole sustainability movement. One was on the sustainable development as a kind of something in the margin. So we have our economic system and we can make that greener, we can make that more social. So that's what we call incremental change. I mean, bit by bit, but not really going into the root causes of the problem. And we also had the concept of the strong sustainability. And maybe not a surprise, but I was quite an advocate for the strong sustainability, because there it was more embedded that you had planetary boundaries, that you had social boundaries, and that you really had to go into the, let's say, to the root causes of the problems and try to change the whole system. So not the incremental change, but really going more fundamental and try to change the other things, which is, I think we will come back later to that in our discussion, because that's as such is already a 3-4 hours webinar needed. But the role of the SCP within the whole SDG agenda is quite important. It is, as we say, at the heart of the SDGs, because we are talking about the economy. And for now, at least in our, let's say, actual world, for most of the people, the economy is the most important. And it is there where everything goes wrong, because we have the wrong system in our economy. I mean, at least we need to regulate a lot of things. And there SCP comes in. So it is related with, let's say, with all the other goals, of course. Within the SCP, so you have, let's say, as I said, you have 17 goals, but you have 169 targets. So within the SCP, we have several targets as well. Yeah, I'm not going to read them all, but I think it's important to know that there is a target on food waste. There are targets around public procurement, sustainable tourism, but also phasing out harmful subsidies, etc., etc. So it's quite broad. It is indeed, yeah. I mean, and all the targets also have their own indicators. So it's quite broad perspective on what SCP is. There is no fair trade mentioned. I can already tell you that nobody talks within the SCP on fair trade, but there is that target that companies are encouraged to accept sustainable practices. So, I mean, if you're positive, you can see, okay, here it isn't kind, at least, of referred to. So why SCP? Well, first of all, this is just three things. I mean, there are many reasons, of course, why we should focus on sustainable consumption and production. First of all, that we have a lot of food waste. So one of the things that the targets will try to decrease the food waste. The other thing, and that is quite important, and yeah, that's a little bit my background, because I always worked on raw materials and natural resources. I mean, on mining, etc., etc. Is that we, if we keep on living as we do now, if in the north and if in the global south, if we see this kind of developments where consumption is key. If we see this development as let's say, good for the whole world, and if the other people on the other side of the world want to have this kind of consumptions, then we will need at least 3 or 4 planets, and that is, of course, not possible. Another thing is that sustainable consumption and production is also very substantial for poverty alleviation, eradication. And also, if we do it in the right way, also that it will give the transition to low carbon and green economies or sustainable economies. So that's why I say that sustainable consumption production is indeed at the heart of the SDGs. As I said, from already in 2002, it was in 2002 that the 10-year framework on SCP started. So before the SDGs, that's also a UN process. So the 10-year framework on SCP is now called One Planet, and they have 6 programs they work on. I know that fair trade is involved in some of those programs. I'm sure they are involved in sustainable public procurement. So that's, let's say, public procurement. I don't know if you know what it is, but that cities and governments, etc. I mean, let's say official entities, they have to buy things. And that will often be done by public procurement. So they ask companies to bid for to give, let's say, a bid for their stuff. And public procurement, I don't have all the actual facts, but it's quite a lot. I mean, if you look at the whole consumption of the world, what is bought by public offices is quite big. It's a huge amount. So if you can sell your in this, let's say, in our case, fair trade products via public procurement, that would be always very great, because that will you give a lot of markets. Sustainable buildings, sustainable tourism, as I said, and then the sustainable food systems program, which is mostly on agriculture. I think they're also involved in that one, but I'm not sure. Fair trade, consumer information for SCP, and sustainable lifestyles in education, which I think is quite an important program as well, because it's also our lifestyle that is quite related to our way of consuming or not consuming. So for the third part is we are going to talk and discuss the role of the fair trade in the 2030 agenda. I mentioned already, it's not mentioned, which is unfortunate, I think, because it should have been mentioned, but it's not. But of course, it is part of the 2030 agenda, because trade is quite important in the world. And that's why it is part of the SEP, etc., etc. But why can we say that fair trade can be a driver for achieving the SDGs? If a fair price as an example, for the coffee is paid to a small producer, the family, of course, has more funds to eat, but also to send the kids to school, which is SDG 4. They will also have funds for making their production more organic, less pesticides, and even to hire other persons. And that, of course, is a range of SDGs that we are covering there. If you just give a fair price to the producer of coffee, that's an example. We can have many of these kind of examples on fashion, on bananas, on all kind of other things. That's why it is so very important, I think, that advocating for fair trade is crucial in the debates on the SCP and the SDGs. I think it's not done enough, not yet, but it should be done, because achieving fair trade is not only something to be considered for a very small market segment. It should be part of everything. It should be common sense. I mean, we just hope that after 20, 30 years, we don't talk about fair trade anymore, because trade is fair as such, let's say. So it's kind of mainstreamed and getting the obvious thing to do. But for now, because we have so much unfair trade, we still need to advocate for fair trade. But that's why it is so important to advocate for fair trade in this whole discussion on the SDGs. I just explained that the extraction of natural resources is also because the prices of the natural resources is just too low. And that's why we can consume it that much, because the price is too low for things. The same for transport, etc. So that's why it is important that fair trade is getting the common sense of all trade activities. Fair trade is absolutely condition for achieving SCP, because we will never achieve sustainable consumption and production in a free market. A free market needs to be regulated, because if you only have a free market, you have very low incomes, salaries, there is no paid for environmental damage, etc. So in a difficult wording, you can say that we need to internalize internalize the externalities in the price. So that means if you pay for something, you pay not only the production costs, you also pay, of course, the income, a fair price or for the product, or a good income for the people who is doing who is working, producing the stuff. But also you also pay for the CO2 emissions. The compensation for it. You also pay for compensating environmental damage that is done, or maybe you pay for a better technique for avoiding environmental damage. So that means that, let's say, sustainable products or fair trade products are often more expensive, but it's also, I think, a consequence of internalizing the externalities in the price. Fair trade, as I said, is missing in the whole SDG agenda. There is a lot said about production, how to produce, production patterns. There is a lot said about the consumption, conscious consumption and fair consumption, etc. But the way, let's say, that the product is going to the consumer, which is trade, is not considered very well, or sometimes too implicit. But there are potential conflicts in the fair trade and the SDGs. Not conflicts. I would not mention them as conflicts, but what you see happening, let's say. First of all, especially in the global north, you have it also in the global south, is the culture of cheap. Low prices are seen as good. I'm sure I'm not talking about you as you are advocating already for fair trade, but let's say most of the people are very happy that stuff is very cheap. If a price is rising of something, then people are already protesting. We see it now with the gas prices, and we can have that discussion as well. I think that is something that is sometimes a barrier for fair trade, because it's very difficult. Let's say you don't have the majority of the people that are willing to pay more for a product. We all know that fair trade coffee is more expensive than the normal coffee, the coffee where the price of the coffee beans are much lower than often the market price. That's a problem. We also have to deal with the competition law. Competition law as such is a good thing. Competition law means that companies are not allowed to have price agreements before, let's say, to kind of agree with each other that, okay, this is the price for something, and then the consumer have to pay it because there is that monopoly of that price. So let's say if the idea of the competition law is okay. But for sustainability and for fair trade, but also for, broader than fair trade, it's sometimes a problem, because if you start to negotiate, say, okay, we want to have a higher price because we really want to have the farmers to receive a decent income, that is also against the competition law. So there we have to see that an instrument that's in say is okay, but has negative consequences for increasing the amount of sustainability products or fair trade products. Another thing is that when we talk about the bigger trade agreements, we are often, they are often talking to the wrong ones. Trade agreements between Canada or between Latin America, between Brazil, etc., with Europe, is not discussed with the smaller companies or the farmers or the peasants or whatever. That's an agreement between the multinationals and the governments. So you have unequal power in those trade negotiations. So we also have often the wrong trade agreements, because it is maybe good for those multinationals, but it's not always, or often, I would even say, not good for the smaller farmers, the smaller companies, or the cooperatives, etc., etc. They are often suffering with this kind of trade agreements, and that's, of course, why a lot of civil society organizations are against it. So now we are going to see to discuss something on the economic growth, because I think the questions also to trade or not to trade. There is that obsession of economic growth. We maybe all agree that that's not the best indicator for measuring well-being. Trade is maybe not an objective as well. So what about fair trades? I mean, if we say that we want to have all trades fair, do we still have to increase the fair trades? I mean, I think if you just think about the planetary boundaries we just discussed in the first part, I mean, how does that go with trade as such, and also with fair trade? But I hope this works. I will see. I'll just click on play, and then I hope you can see it and also have the sound. It's just 1 minute, so it's not very long. But I think it's quite funny.
From birth to puberty, a hamster doubles its weight each week. If it didn't stop when mature, as animals do, and continue to double, on its first birthday, we would be staring at a 9 billion ton hamster. This hamster could eat all of the corn produced annually worldwide in a single day and still be hungry. There is a reason why, in nature, things grow in size only to a certain point. So why do most economists and politicians think that the economy can grow forever and ever and ever?
I hope you had sound as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's okay. So that worked at least. I really love this 1 minute because it says so much, and it is really a good start for discussing the economic growth, etc. So I think we still have some time, and I think it's important that we have that time for discussing with all of us the future for fair trade. As I said, I think those are just 4 things that I was thinking about, but maybe you have others, is that all trades should be fair trade and not staying in the niche. I mean, it is really not only a kind of a feeling good of drinking fair trade coffee or having fair trade fashion. It's I think we can feel good if all fashion is fair trade, if all coffee is fair trade. So it's an advocacy model as well. It's not only creating a niche in the market for fair trade. I mean, it's also advocating for fair trade worldwide and on everything that has to do with trade. One of the things is also, that is done also by the World Fair Trade Organizations International. They have reports on other business models, changing the current production patterns. That means with corporations, not only having stakeholders, but also that the profit is going to the members of the corporation. It's also what we call the B corporates, so social profit instead of only economic profit. It's also leasing models. Instead of buying things, you can lease things. We have it already with cars, of course. You have the car sharing, etc. But I mean, you can also think about washing machines. I mean, why having a washing machine? I mean, you're never the proud owner of a washing machine. You're happy to have a washing machine because you have something in your room, in your house, where you can put your dirty wash in, and after half an hour, clean wash comes out. So that can also be leased. Once you have that leasing system of washing machines, I mean, this is just an example. The producer of the washing machines will make those washing machines more durable. Now the producer, the company, Miele or Siemens or whoever, Sanusi, I mean, they are making washing machines with the idea that after 3-4 years, they are stuck and that you buy a new washing machine. If it's a leasing machine, they will make it for 20 years. I mean, like the old washing machines that my parents had. I mean, those lasted for 20 years. The new washing machines, they last for 3 years or 5 years, but let's say not that long. So I think it's really about other business models. I mean, changing this production patterns, but also consumption patterns, because I mean, leasing things is also for the consumer something different. All the fair trades, I mean, that's the third point, all the fair trade products should also be reusable, repairable, recyclable, and less packaging. Sometimes, and I'm not saying always, but sometimes I see fair trade products that then when I think, well, I don't know if this is fair trade. I mean, it may be fair trades in trades, trade conditions, but often it's also gadgets that are not reusable, not recyclable, etc. So I think there, the fair trade movement can still make some progress, that all the products are also, let's say, environmentally friendly, not only friendly, but also, all the R's I just mentioned. Another thing that I think is very important for the future for fair trade, and that's not something new, it's already one of the principles of the World Federation of World Fair Trade Organizations, is that we should increase the South-South and North-North fair trade. Fair trade, when it started, it was mostly also a North-South thing. So the people in the global North bought stuff from the global South made in a fair trade way. I think it was already 20 years ago when I started to discuss with people in Belgium, why would I drink fair trade wine from Chile? It's coming from very, very far. So why? And the people in Chile, because I lived for a while in South America, the people in Chile are drinking French wine because it's fancy to drink French wine. So why not try to kind of convince the people in Chile to drink their own fair trade organic wine, and then we will drink the French wine, so that you kind of shorten your production chain as well. Not to say that it should be forbidden, but I think it's at least we could decrease the transport miles, as we call them, from food and many other things. So that's why I think it's important that South-South fair trade and North-North fair trade is very important as well.